Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what you want to see next.
Not far from Lu Sheng, there was a snowy mountain, and the sky was clear. With a calm expression, our boy began to scan his surroundings and sighed upon seeing ice. He became curious as he did not know exactly where he was. Several penguins surrounded him. The tentacles that Lu Sheng had previously cut off grew back on his body. He placed one hand on his waist, and his attention fixed on them, realizing that he was in Antarctica. The eyes on his abdomen started staring at him intently and growling to get his attention, and it worked very well. Lu Sheng was furious, and without hesitating for even a second, clenched his fist tightly and punched one of the eyes. His eyes filled with seriousness, he began to stare at them intently and made one thing clear now that they were inside his body. They had to obey him, or otherwise they would die. Lu Sheng's eyes widened in surprise. He realized that his alien body had its own consciousness. But this didn't matter since they had dared to betray him and join the enemy. If he couldn't even fully control his own body, there was no point in practicing martial arts. The eyes reactivated. They started observing Lu Sheng and growled again. While the tentacles floated, our boy clenched his fist and fixed his attention on them. With a serious expression, he explained that if they didn't want to die, then they must follow his rules. First was to follow his orders, second was to condense energy, then transform, and finally sublimate. Lu Sheng closed his eyes and sank into his thoughts. He decided it was time to establish some clear rules for the cells. Inside his body, there were a bunch of alien blue cells. He concentrated and a golden energy began to approach the cells. He had never tried this before, but he wanted to know what would happen when the cells took the same path as the immortal cells. Lu Sheng closed his eyes and began to concentrate, making a powerful golden energy appear in his chest. He wanted to know what kind of existence was going to be born when these cells followed the path of the immortal cells, questioning if they were going to be able to resist the annihilation of the rules. The energy little by little began to enter the cell nucleus, one after another, due to the constant impact of refinement. The alien cells little by little began to sublimate and experience active apoptosis. Lu Sheng decided to concentrate all the energy in a single point. He fixed his spiritual force on that point and infused all his energy with all his strength, causing the cell nucleus to start shining intensely. The cells began to undergo changes, first about 10,000 times until reaching 1,000,000 times. A smoke screen appeared around Lu Sheng, and once it disappeared, it could be seen that his body had returned to normal, and there no longer seemed to be traces of the alien cells. Lu Sheng's eyes were filled with sadness, and his attention was fixed on his hand. It was a pity because just after billions of transformations, he was about to enter a new level. But the energy of the alien cells had been exhausted and he had no choice but to temporarily stop the process to enter hibernation. Not every trace of his previous body had disappeared. In his hand there was still a blue eye, which was slowly beginning to close. Once the eye closed, Lu Sheng began observing carefully and realized that this path was viable, so he decided to try transforming the cells later. Just then, the sound of a ship's horn was heard. Lu Sheng's eyes spread in surprise. He turned around and couldn't help but feel somewhat astonished. In the middle of Antarctica, there was a large ship sailing the sea. It was gigantic and seemed very luxurious. The attention of our boy fixed on the ship. He hid behind the iceberg and began to observe without knowing what a ship was doing in this area. He jumped and started to fly. He wanted to take advantage of this moment to confirm the place where he was now. The ship was sailing at full speed, breaking the ice in its path. Lu Sheng started flying, got a little closer, and his gaze filled with confusion since on the ship there were 30 warriors below level 7, 2 level 7 masters. Additionally, there was a scientific room, so there could be a level 8 Grand Master supervising. By their appearance, they all seemed to be people from the Lion Kingdom. For him this was something suspicious and strange. What caught his attention the most was the level 8 Grand Master. The ship was very luxurious. It had several floors and on the highest one there were a lot of people. Lu Sheng's eyes began to shine. Using his powers, he started scanning the area to see where the level 8 Grand Master was. Several minutes later, he found the room where the Grand Master was. Somewhere on the ship, there was a couple sitting on the sofa, having a good time. The level 8 Grandmaster was a man with orange hair. Above him was a sexy woman. The man began observing her and couldn't help but smile. Lu Sheng realized that this guy was nothing more than a womanizer and lover of drinking. Next to them was a table on which there was a ring with a purple eye. Lu Sheng paid attention and realized that judging by the pattern of the ring, it was an ocular ring. Our boy was perplexed and confused. This ship belonged to the research organization Ocular known as Huan. His mind filled with curiosity, so he decided to take a look at the other rooms in search of information. In some other room of the ship, there was a woman with blue hair sitting and writing something. She seemed to have the best room since sunlight was coming directly through the window. She picked up the pen and with a cheerful expression began to write in her diary. Today was February 14th of the year 317 and it was sunny weather. It was her 25th Valentine's Day. She wasn't enjoying red wine or steak at an elegant restaurant. No music fitting for the occasion nor an attractive companion for a date. She was going to spend this day alone in the cabin of the explorer, amidst the extreme cold of Antarctica, surrounded by penguins and exotic creatures. She began to imagine a man wearing a scientist's lab coat, with his arms behind his back. This was the 28th day since she had joined Professor Nepsen's research team, one of the greatest masters in genetics of this century and on the entire planet. His vast knowledge, brilliant ideas, and passionate attitude toward academic pursuit were everything worth learning for her. A smile spread across her face as she continued writing in her diary. Her eyes were full of admiration because being able to follow Professor Nepsen was the luckiest thing that had happened to her in life. She thanked her university mentor, Mrs. Selena, because if it weren't for her enthusiastic recommendation, she wouldn't be here. With a cheerful expression, she continued jotting everything down in her diary. Lu Sheng transformed into a spirit, appeared behind her, placed his hand under his chin, and with a curious gaze began to read attentively. After reading her long diary, he more or less understood the background of this ship. This ship was a team tasked with collecting and researching genes from exotic beasts around the Indian Ocean. This also explained why there were strong warriors on board. Hunting exotic beasts to obtain genetic samples required powerful fighters. The expression of our boy changed, and his eyes widened in surprise as something caught his attention. The girl did not notice Lu Sheng's presence and continued distractedly writing in her diary. The leader of this team seemed to be the Professor Nepsen mentioned in the diary, so he estimated that guy must have quite a high status within the organization, like a golden figure. He began to imagine an eye surrounded by beasts. It was worth noting that Professor Nepsen seemed to have a different perspective from the mainstream on the origin of mutated beasts and martial arts. He considered that both originated in the mythical concepts of demons and gods, and he had always tried to prove it, often hearing that science ends in mythology. The girl placed the pen on the table, closed her eyes, and with a smile stretched her arms. This was all she had to write in the journal for today. Just before she could move, Lu Sheng moved like lightning and appeared in front of her. With a piercing gaze, he demanded to know who Professor Nelson was. The woman's eyes filled with fear and confusion. She couldn't help but panic, asking who he was. Upon seeing that this method was not going to work, Lu Sheng activated mental control and began to imbue waves into her mind. The ability took effect, and in a matter of seconds, the girl calmed down, and with a serene gaze, she began to observe our boy. She took out a photograph of Professor Nepsen. He was an old man who wore glasses. Lu Sheng started observing the photo carefully, thanked her, and then disappeared. The girl remained paralyzed, holding the photo for several seconds. Once the mental control stopped taking effect, she returned to normal and with a confused gaze questioned whether she had fallen asleep. Her attention was fixed on the photo of Professor Nepsen. She began to imagine the professor winking at her. She couldn't help but blush like a tomato and be in shock. She didn't know why she was staring intently at the photo of Professor Nepsen. Today was Valentine's Day, and she thought that maybe she'd made some fantasy about him. Somewhere on the ship, there was a research laboratory. Inside was Professor Nepsen. He had his head resting on his arms and was sleeping like a log. On the table were several folders. He was dreaming, thinking that Berlin's mythologies were very different from those of other countries, believing that perhaps they could bring new ideas. Lu Sheng entered the laboratory and began to gaze silently at Professor Nepsen. Without making any noise, he picked up one of the folders. His eyes widened in surprise. It was a compilation of data on ancient myths from Dragonland, ancient myths from Lionland, and mythological origins from Eagleland. He was confused to see that they had moved so many resources just for these legends of dubious authenticity. Professor Nepsen kept sleeping like a log. Lu Sheng couldn't help but smile, realizing that this organization was very rich. He thought that maybe he could take advantage of this to get some benefit from them. Lu Sheng transformed into energy and disappeared without a trace. He left the ship and returned outside. While the energy was entering his body, his attention focused on the beautiful landscape. His eyes filled with surprise as something caught his attention. He activated his power, making golden energy appear around him. He started flying through the sky at great speed. He decided to lend himself for a purpose. Not far from the area, there was another ship. On the deck were two men, one of whom had both hands resting on the railing and mentioned that it would be a week before they returned. The old man who was looking through binoculars replied that it would be less time. He had noticed that some of the team leaders no longer wanted to stay. He put down the binoculars and with a sincere expression explained that following a scientific research team as just an ordinary worker was exhausting. But everything depended on what Professor Nepson said. Although he seemed weak and fragile, his position in the organization was no less than that of those with higher royal emblems. Even those with common royal emblems did not dare contradict him. The other man turned toward him and couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised. The old man's watch began to ring. With a curious gaze, he started looking at the watch without knowing what was happening. Someone revealed to the captain that suddenly a powerful underwater current had emerged beneath them, diverting the ship, asking them to look ahead. In front of them was an iceberg. The captain was in shock, giving the order to turn the helm as soon as possible. The other man put his hands on his head and couldn't help but panic. Just a moment ago, the iceberg wasn't in the area and had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. They couldn't control the ship in time and turn the helm, causing it to crash forcefully against the iceberg. The ship stopped in place, and inside the iceberg was someone. It was none other than Lu Sheng. He began to gaze at the ground, and a smile spread across his face.